Your DNA is older than your name. What you carry, your family carried. And sometimes what your family carried was a choice. 3 decades ago, a woman you've never met sat in a doctor's office and received a sentence disguised as information. It was about a gene, a single faulty gene. And it would alter everything, not just for her, but for millions watching from their homes, wondering if that same gene lived inside their own cells. Her name was Angelina Jolie, and in 2013, she did something most celebrities never do. She told the truth. The story sounds like this. A mother dies of ovarian cancer at 56. A grandmother dies of cancer. An aunt dies of cancer. The family tree becomes a family graveyard. And then one day, a blood test reveals why. The BRCA1 gene, a gene discovered in 1994 by researchers who found that inside it lives an instruction for a protein. That protein is supposed to repair the tiny breaks that accumulate in your DNA every single day. But when that gene carries a mutation, the protein doesn't work. The damage doesn't get fixed. And year after year, damage piles up until cells don't know what they are anymore. They multiply. They forget to stop. They become cancer. Subscribe right now because what happens next will change how you see inheritance, and not just of sickness. Hit subscribe and you'll follow along as we decode what it means to carry a gene that almost nobody talks about, even though about 1 in 350 people do. But to understand what Angelina Jolie's decision really meant, you first have to understand what she was choosing between, because this isn't a story about a gene alone. It's a story about the power of knowing what lives inside you and the courage it takes to refuse to wait for it to activate. Here's what we're going to follow today: the science of the BRCA1 mutation and how it rewrites your body's ability to fight cancer. The family history that forced one of the world's most watched women to confront a choice no one should have to make. The moment she made it public, and what that moment changed for millions of others. And by the end, you'll understand why her decision wasn't just about her, it was about everyone carrying the same inherited script. BRCA1 is a tumor suppressor gene. That's the clinical language, but what it actually does is far more intimate. It tells your cells how to repair themselves. When the gene is working correctly, your body is constantly fixing DNA damage from the sun, from stress, from the ordinary wear and tear of being alive. Women with a healthy BRCA1 carry roughly a 12% lifetime risk of breast cancer, the same as most women. But women who inherit a faulty BRCA1 mutation, their risk climbs to somewhere between 55 and 87%. Their ovarian cancer risk climbs to 20 to 50%. The damage isn't being repaired, it's accumulating. And the body is essentially a waiting room. Angelina Jolie's particular mutation gave her an 87% lifetime risk of breast cancer. 87%. Not a possibility, not a maybe. A probability so high that the medical language becomes unavoidable. And it had already cost her family everything. Her mother, her grandmother, her aunt, all dead from the same gene that lived in her blood. Now pause for a moment. Do you know if this gene runs in your family? Do you know if your mother, grandmother, or an aunt died of breast or ovarian cancer before age 70? Keep that in mind as we go deeper, because this matters. Here's where most people assume the story ends. Diagnosis, surgery, survival. But Angelina Jolie did something that made the story impossibly more complicated. She talked about it. In May 2013, she published an essay in the New York Times. Not anonymously, not through a spokesperson. She put her name on it and described in precise and unflinching detail her decision to undergo a preventive double mastectomy, removing both healthy breasts to prevent cancer that hadn't even begun. She was taking the power of the gene out of the future and putting it into the past. She was saying no to waiting. She was saying no to surveillance. She was choosing removal instead. The medical community called this a risk-reducing mastectomy. It dropped her breast cancer risk from 87% to below 5%. 5%. But almost nobody in 2013 was talking about the psychological weight of that choice. Almost nobody was asking whether the same mutation should lead to the same surgery for every woman who carried it. And almost nobody was prepared for what happened next. After her announcement, genetic testing referrals skyrocketed. Clinics reported waiting lists tripled overnight. Women started asking for BRCA testing in numbers nobody had anticipated. The phenomenon became so widespread that researchers named it the Angelina Jolie effect. One woman's choice to go public about her gene had reframed how an entire culture thought about genetic destiny. It was no longer a silent inheritance. It was a conversation. But here's what makes this story stranger than anyone expected. The research suggests that inheriting BRCA1 or BRCA2 is relatively rare. About 1 in 350 people in the general population carry it. But in women of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, the rate is much higher, 1 in 40. This is a gene that runs through certain populations more than others. And that's not a coincidence. BRCA mutations accumulate in family lines, passed down through mothers and fathers equally for generations. You carry it because your mother carried it, or your father did. You carry it because someone in your bloodline survived long enough to pass it on. You carry the inheritance of your family's persistence and its vulnerability. Angelina Jolie's family history wasn't just bad luck, it was a pattern written in DNA. Her mother died in 2007, 2 years before Jolie was tested, 2 years before she knew why. Cancer had been so relentless in her family. And once she knew, once the invisible became visible, the choice became unavoidable. But here's where it gets stranger. Her decision to have preventive surgery wasn't universally praised. Some researchers argued that not every woman with a BRCA1 mutation needed surgery. Some pointed out that intensive surveillance, MRI scans, frequent mammograms, close monitoring, could catch cancers early enough to treat them successfully without removing tissue. Surveillance meant living with vigilance. Surgery meant claiming back your future. Both were choices. Neither was wrong. But Jolie chose the one that let her tell her children something specific. They don't need to fear they will lose me to breast cancer. She chose certainty over probability. The moment she published that essay, the entire conversation shifted. Women who had never considered genetic testing started asking for it. Women who carried the mutation silently for years suddenly found thousands of others asking the same questions she was asking. Genetic counselors became overwhelmed. Tests that used to take weeks to get scheduled started having waiting lists. The Supreme Court had ruled just weeks earlier in 2013 that genes cannot be patented, which meant the BRCA test was no longer controlled by a single laboratory. Testing became accessible, and Jolie's visibility became the catalyst that turned knowledge from privilege into possibility. Pause again. If you learned you carried BRCA1, how would that change your relationship to your body? How would it change your faith in your own future? This is what millions have had to reckon with since Jolie made her choice public. Here's what the research shows about the inheritance pattern. BRCA1 mutations follow family lines with brutal clarity. If your mother carries it, your chance of inheriting it is 50%. If your father carries it, same odds. And if you carry it, your children have 50% odds with every child you have. This is not a gene that disappears. It's passed hand to hand through generations. It's why Jolie's decision to speak publicly about it was an act of breaking a silence that had lasted decades in her family and in thousands of families like hers. The Angelina Jolie effect isn't just a name, it's documented in medical journals. After our 2013 disclosure, genetic testing requests increased across multiple countries. Referrals to cancer genetics clinics increased. But here's the important part that researchers have tracked. The increase wasn't chaotic. Women weren't blindly requesting surgery. Women were requesting genetic counseling. They were asking the right questions. They were trying to understand whether their family history warranted testing, whether a positive result meant surgery was inevitable, whether there were other options. Jolie's choice didn't dictate other women's choices. It opened the conversation for women to have options at all. But the inheritance doesn't stop at genetics. There's also the inheritance of secrecy. For years, families with BRCA mutations often didn't tell anyone. Cancer was treated as a private shame. Genetic predisposition was treated as a family secret. Relatives who carried the same mutation didn't always know it. And so women continued to die of cancers that could have been caught earlier or prevented entirely because the information was locked inside silence. Angelina Jolie's decision to publish her story, not just to her family, but to the world, broke that pattern. She transformed a private genetic inheritance into a public conversation. She said, "This gene lives in me. It lived in my mother. It will live in some of my children, statistically, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm going to tell you what I chose, and I'm going to let you decide what's right for you." The numbers shifted after her announcement in ways researchers are still tracking. BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations only account for 5 to 10% of all breast cancers. That's important. It means most women who develop breast cancer don't carry these mutations. But for the women who do carry them, the inheritance isn't probabilistic. It's a statistical certainty. Not that they'll develop cancer, but that without intervention, their risk climbs to numbers that feel less like odds and more like destiny. And Jolie chose not to wait for destiny to arrive. A year after her first essay, Jolie made another announcement. She'd undergone ovarian surgery as well, removing her ovaries and fallopian tubes to eliminate her ovarian cancer risk, which hovered around 50%. The decision was quieter. The world was listening less closely, but the medical reality was the same. She was erasing the future the gene had written for her. She was rewriting it. Here's what millions of women watching learned from her. You don't have to accept the inheritance of sickness as inevitable. The gene is real. The risk is real. But the choice is yours. You can surveil and monitor and hope. You can operate and remove and prevent. You can live with the knowledge or without it. but you don't have to suffer in silence, and you don't have to suffer alone. The inheritance that matters most isn't the gene itself. It's the knowledge that you can choose how to respond to it. Angelina Jolie inherited a faulty BRCA1 gene from one of her parents. She inherited cancer from her family's history. But she also inherited something else, the courage to say no to a script that felt already written. To say, I know what my body carries, I know what my family lost, and I'm going to decide what my future looks like. That's the inheritance she gave everyone watching. Not the gene, the choice, not the sickness, the power to know what lives inside you and to act on that knowledge before the silence becomes permanent. You carry the inheritance of survivors. You carry a record of persistence written in your cells. Sometimes, like Angelina Jolie, you carry the inheritance of vulnerability too. But carrying it doesn't mean being passive toward it. It means knowing. And knowing means you get to choose. If this landed for you, if you're thinking about your own family history, your own inherited risks, whether you know them or not, hit like. It genuinely helps more people find their own story. Comment which part hit hardest for you. The moment Jolie chose to go public, the medical reality of BRCA1's inheritance, or the idea that knowing your genetic inheritance gives you power instead of just fear? Send this to a woman in your life who carries risk and deserves to know she's not alone in that inheritance. And I went even deeper on the history of genetic testing and how mutations accumulate in certain populations differently. And honestly, it reveals something stranger than this. How knowledge itself became a tool, and how some families were given access to it centuries before others. Watch your ass that next. Carry your story well. It has come a very long way.